Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, Editor-in-Chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. One of the most important weapons in the arsenal of contemporary anti-Semites and Israel haters is the big lie that Israel is an apartheid state. On its face, this claim, which attempts to analogize white minority-ruled South Africa with a democratic Jewish state with a majority Jewish population, is absurd. Yet, the use of the phrase Apartheid Israel has become so pervasive in forums like the United Nations and on college campuses that it is reflexively believed by many whose knowledge of the Middle East is either minimal or superficial, or who are predisposed to believe any canard promoted by left-wing groups and institutions. The question of the origins of this big lie is not merely of academic interest. Understanding how and why certain groups chose these tactics and how they were able to generate support and interest in it is key to understanding the troubling rise of contemporary anti-Semitism and the way it masquerades as mere anti-Zionism or even as faux support for human rights. That's why it is vital to delve into the history of its use and the way it came to life during the infamous UN Conference Against Racism held in Durban, South Africa in 2001, only days before the 9/11 attacks. Nor can we ignore the way this event and the forces behind it were using it to revive the equally anti-Semitic charge that Zionism is racism that had successfully been promoted by the Soviet Union and its allies in the 1970s at the United Nations. To discuss this and the way this anti-Semitic slander was insinuated into public discourse is someone whose career has been devoted to exposing the truth about both anti-Semitism and the United Nations. Professor Anne Bayefsky is the director of the Touro Institute on Human Rights and the Holocaust, a UN-accredited non-governmental organization, and president of Human Rights Voices based in New York. She has taught international law, constitutional law, and civil liberties at universities in both Canada and the United States and monitored the United Nations from the inside, beginning in 1984. She has served with the Canadian delegation to the UN General Assembly and the Commission on Human Rights, and with non-governmental delegations to UN World Conferences in Vienna, Beijing, and Durban, as well as to the Human Rights Council. She is the author or editor of 13 books in the areas of international and constitutional human rights law and the recipient of the Boris Laskin National Fellowship in Human Rights Research, Canada's highest human rights research award. She attended the Durban Conference in 2001 as a representative of the International Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists. And she's been at the forefront of a 20-year-long effort to expose the Durban agenda, including participating in Durban 2 in Geneva in 2009, and a successful effort to get the world's major democracies to pull out of Durban 3 in 2011. She's currently leading the effort to convince democracies to boycott the Durban 4 20th anniversary next month at the United Nations, and is organizing a conference seeking to counter it that will also be held in September. Anne Bayefsky, welcome to Top Story.
Nice to be with you, Jonathan.
Thank you. And first off, tell us about why the 2001 Durban Conference was so important and why it continues to be something that we ought to worry about.
The Durban Conference was a world conference against racism. And the importance of it is that it attracted non-governmental organizations, thousands of them, and governments and states from all over the world to one place for one purpose, and that is, in theory, to combat racism. The fact that it wasn't the first time that the United Nations had held a world conference against racism, it was the third time. But in the previous two occasions, post-dated the General Assembly's adoption in 1975 of the Zionism is Racism Resolution, and before it was rescinded, revoked. So the United States boycotted those two previous conferences. This was the first time when the entire world came together with the understanding that it was supposed to combat racism worldwide. Now, in that environment, you had overt anti-Semitism. In fact, the anti-Semitism of Durban became a watchword of the non-governmental forum that preceded it, and was part and parcel of the government conference itself. So suddenly you have this anti-racism forum turning into a forum for racism, for anti-Semitism. And this was a shock to some people. I think if you'd been around the United Nations for the previous 20 years, it might not have been that much of a shock. But the reality was that Durban represented the hijacking of the concept of racism to promote anti-Semitism. But as I say, if you want to know something about the history of it, it didn't start there. In fact, I reminded myself to look back at the U.S. Ambassador Daniel Patrick Moynihan's speech in 1975 when the General Assembly adopted the Zionism as racism resolution. And, you know, just because it resonates today, all these years later, he said, "A great evil has been loosed upon the world. The abomination of anti-Semitism has been given the appearance of international sanction." Well, that's exactly what happened in 2001. And he says, he points to the fact that this has done a great harm. The United Nations, he says, will now be known as a place where lies are told. Indeed. And he says far more serious, grave, and perhaps irreparable harm will be done to the cause of human rights itself, which in fact it was. So, yes, the Zionism is racism. Canard was revoked in 1991. But all the institutional framework set up to, in fact, implement the Zionism as racism resolution was left intact. And only within less than a decade, the United Nations came up with the next formula, which was the Durban formula.
Right. That's very important, and I'm glad you read that quote from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, because that put it right in perspective. That really nailed it. But tell me more about your experiences. You were there. You saw it. You heard it. What was it like? What happened? What did you take away from that experience?
Well, you know, I had preceded my time in Durban by working with the UN human rights establishment very closely prior to that. And I had been asked by Mary Robinson, who was then the High Commissioner for Human Rights, to do a review of the UN human rights legal system, which I did. This is in the late 90s, leading up to 2001. And so I became friendly with Mary, and I thought she was a decent person, former president of Ireland. And so when it became clear in the lead up to Durban, as others have pointed out, that the institution and the conference was in danger of being hijacked, I went to see her in Geneva, and we sat in her beautiful room of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which overlooks the lake. And I said, you know, I don't think you should go. You're going to ruin, or the UN will suffer in terms of its stature. You yourself will pay a price for being associated with it. She was the Secretary General of the conference. And she looked at me and she said, and I'm quoting her, "Anne, I've just met with Yasser Arafat, and he assures me he will not politicize the conference. So that's the last time I spoke to Mary Robinson. And at that point in time, I wasn't going to go to Durban. That was July. It was only a month away. And I decided I really had no choice. And I decided to go to the conference, and I represented the International Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists. And what happened to me personally, which happened to other Jewish representatives there, were the NGO forum was divided into caucuses, known as victims caucuses. So the Jews were in the Jewish victims caucus. We could talk about anti-Semitism. Palestinians had their caucus, et cetera, et cetera. And the international organizations, human rights organizations, had their caucus. And I was a member of their organization, their caucus as well, because it was the International Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists. So in any case, we were allowed to hold a open session on anti-Semitism on the grounds of the NGO forum. And it was shut down by I spoke at it. It was shut down by a screaming mob of people yelling, and I'm quoting them, "You are killers, you are killers." This was the forum.
Who were these people, Anne, who were forming that mob?
For lack of a better word, activists. And I'm not going to call them pro-Palestinian activists. They were anti-Israel activists. They wore T-shirts that said Israel, Apartheid Israel on them. In fact, I have a picture of me that I didn't know was being taken with me speaking, and that's my audience. There's pictures from the back, and that's what their backs say. Israel's an apartheid state, etc. So, we were silenced. B, we held a news conference to draw attention to the anti-Semitism, disrupted in front of CNN, which then had no choice but to report it, by another screaming mob who wouldn't let us speak. Simon Wiesenthal Center and myself and others, a few others were there, and we weren't allowed to even hold a news conference. The JCC, the Jewish Community Center, where we met every morning to caucus and talk about plans, was shut down because the police couldn't guarantee our safety. On the final night, the NGOs all met in a big tent to discuss the final NGO declaration. And the Jewish caucus put forward a resolution saying, objecting to the anti-Semitism and tying the language of Zionism as racism to anti-Semitism and et cetera, and the violent rejection of the state of Israel to anti-Semitism. There was a move was made to delete the words of the Jewish caucus. It was adopted by a vote of virtually everyone there. The international human rights organizations, Human Rights First, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, decided not to vote with the Jewish caucus. And we got up and began to walk out. And the police came in and hustled us out, saying, "You're in danger, you're in physical danger." And they literally rushed us out of the premises in order not to be harmed. So here was the context was an anti-racism conference. The NGO declaration ended up saying Zionism is racism and so on. And all those major human rights NGOs refused to vote against Zionism as racism. So, but the lie that's told is that it was all about NGOs, and that's patently false. Because I went on to the government conference where I wore a T-shirt in my own little provocative way saying, "Fight racism, not Jews." So I'm wearing my T-shirt. I have a few extra of my T-shirt, and it's confiscated by the security of the governmental conference. What was not confiscated confiscated was all over the tables. There were signs reading, I have copies of them. It says, "Down with the Nazi Israeli apartheid." That was allowed to be distributed, and my Fight Racism Not Jews was confiscated. So I sat there in the meetings, the negotiations, and listened to all of the language on combating anti-Semitism and teaching about the Holocaust was removed from the government conference. And so that was all part of the governmental conference. So the United States walked out. I remember standing beside Tom Lantos's wife as
The late,
the
the
head of
late
the
Congressman
American
Tom
delegation.
Lantos, who was himself a
Late
survivor.
Congressman, the only Holocaust survivor to serve in Congress, head of the American delegation. And he and Secretary of State Colin Powell, who remained in Washington, the two of them had decided together, but on a bipartisan basis, an African American Holocaust survivor, to leave the Durban Conference in disgust, and they did so with the State of Israel by their side.
Yeah, that is quite a story. It was quite an event where the UN basically organized a conference seemingly to promote anti-Semitism and to promote canards against the Jews. As you say, anybody who had followed the United Nations closely couldn't be terribly surprised. But that was the sheer brazen nature of it was something of a surprise. That was kind of a turning point, don't you think?
And I think, well, they adopted in the end the Durban Declaration. The European Union struck a deal with Arab states whereby reparations would be, they wouldn't be forced to pay for certain things that they didn't want to pay for, about having to do with money. And the Israel bashing stuff would be left in. That was the deal. And but the Durban Declaration, therefore, does two things that I think are really important to understand. The Durban Declaration says Israel is the only country in the world named in a global anti-racism manifest. The only country. And furthermore, Israel is the only country singled out in the Durban Declaration as victimizing anybody for racism, the world over. So when people say, "Oh, I don't really understand it, it's too complicated," that's all you have to know. It only mentions Israel, doesn't mention the slave trade in Libya, doesn't talk about, ethnic violence rampant in multiple African countries, doesn't talk about ethnic conflict in places like Mauritania, or South Africa itself, for that matter. It only talks about Israel. So what is that, if not anti-Semitism?
Mm-hmm. Indeed, singling out the Jews for treatment that they would not think to try on anyone else. That's exactly right. And with the imprimatur of the United Nations and the international community. Let's take a step back for a moment and talk about origins. Exactly how did this big lie about Israel and apartheid take shape, and who or what was the principal driver of that effort prior to Durban?
Well, going back, way back, since the 60s, 70s, and even before, of course, there was an effort to use the lie of racism and apartheid to destroy Israel by political means, if it could be done by militarily. So I strongly believe that the apartheid label is, and so does the opposition, by the way, believe that it's the golden ticket. It's what will succeed in destroying the state of Israel. It succeeded in destroying South Africa. apartheid South Africa, and it will do the same for Israel if it's allowed to fester and grow, which it's doing at the moment. So it started off, the template built around apartheid South Africa was to isolate, boycott, deny arms for self-protection and self-defense, economically devastate, and to diminish the state such that it would not survive. And
Yeah, just a moment, just to clarify, and so what you're clearly establishing, just interrupt for just a second, is that this is linked to the BDS movement. It's part and parcel of that same mindset, is it
BDS
not?
depends on winning the apartheid argument. Why boycott if there's nothing the matter with the country? So BDS is derivative of the apartheid lie. If once you can establish a country is an apartheid state, it's criminal. It's a violation of international law. It can be prosecuted at the International Criminal Court. And it ought to be subject to boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. So the key is to ensure that the apartheid label is exposed for what it is. And by the way, so if you ask me, where did it start? It started with a successful model of South Africa. The attempts, as you may recall, but you're too young probably, of tying Israel to apartheid South Africa with a whole series of lies about that. And when that didn't work out because it was ridiculous, the effort was then to, when South Africa was freed, to turn Israel into the new South Africa. And that's what's happened. And the thing is, you don't have to take my word for it. It's interesting that I'm jumping ahead, but there are some that say we don't have to take on this apartheid label. It's ridiculous. 1/5 of Israel's population is Arab. Arabs not only serve in the Knesset, but Arab political parties are part of the governing coalition. Arabs serve in the IDF, have represented Israel abroad as ambassadors, serve on the Supreme Court of Israel. It's patently ridiculous. Or almost 100,000 Palestinians work in Israel daily, and yet on the other hand, to turn it around, an Jewish Israeli that takes a wrong turn, and when they're driving a car into what is called Palestinian territories, fears for their life. And there have been cases, of course, where they in fact have been murdered. So, and we have a situation where you might call it apartheid Palestine instead of supposedly apartheid Israel. Well, what is apartheid Palestine anyway? It's in so-called Palestine. The UN refers to it as Palestine. In fact, the UN changed its name to State of Palestine, so that every time you say the word Palestine, you have to say the word state. So the so-called, in quotation marks, State of Palestine will be, when it's actually a state, if and when it's actually a state, will be Judenrein, because Mahmoud Abbas has said that no Israeli Jew who's either soldier or civilian will be allowed to live there. Why?
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, why? Because as he puts it, his words, Jews have filthy feet. So you can't allow, Jews to cohabit.
That's right. And let me just point out, and just to amplify that point, and of course Abbas was also in that with that filthy feet remark was talking about he didn't want Jews to be trotting anywhere near the holy places because he felt that the mere presence of Jews profaned them. And of course, the independent Palestinian state that already exists in all but name in Gaza is itself also, as you say, Judenrein. It's free of Jews, except for the remains of Israeli soldiers that are still being held hostage by the terrorist government of Gaza.
Indeed, but if you carry on looking for the signposts of apartheid in so-called in the Palestinian-controlled territories, selling land to a Jew, if a Palestinian sells land to a Jew, it's punishable by life imprisonment with hard labor. So there's no semblance, no overtly of wanting to cohabit, to coexist. And that's apartheid. So you have this situation where, on the one hand, you have integration and more democratic rights for Arabs in Israel than in any Arab country. And on the other hand, you have apartheid Palestine, which is intended to be is in part and is intended to be Judenrein. So you might think, your eyes glaze over. I mean, who cares? This is so ridiculous, preposterous. Why would this go anywhere? And there's an answer to that question. Mm-hmm. My entire adult life, I've been hearing the phrase shmoom. Being the Hebrew acronym for the United Nations. Shmoom being, it's ridiculous. Well, nobody takes the UN seriously. It doesn't matter. Nothing could be further from the truth. And I'll give you a very modern example of this, which took place in this August in 2021. I told you that in 1991, the Zionism is Racism resolution was revoked. But it was a one line, and the institution and committees, as I said, that were created to implement the Zionism is Racism lie were left in place. They were not revoked. And at the forefront of them is a group called the Committee on the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. Now, this committee still meets constantly. It's a standing body. And this August, it held a meeting with what they call CSOs, civil society organizations. It was by invitation only. So it was selected NGOs. And it met in secret, virtually, but it didn't identify who got invited. But it did release a Chatham House Rules, no identifiers summary of what happened. And I want to read it to you. This is August, right? August 2021. It says, the participating organizations, and they met with selected governments, bastions of human rights like Afghanistan, Cuba, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and the so-called state of Palestine. And the participating organizations raised the following issues. The apartheid framework to look at Israeli policies and practices was gaining traction. The meeting participants called on committee members and observers, in other words, states, to recognize the case of Israel's treatment of Palestinians as apartheid. Participants appealed to just use the definition of apartheid. So we have inside the United Nations a meeting dedicated to ensuring that the apartheid label is now the centerpiece of the UN so-called anti-racism apparatus. And so it's not old, it's not shmoom, it's happening right beneath our noses, and we're doing very precious little to contradict it. especially with this current government in the United States.
Let's move forward, as you say, to the present. There is going to be a Durban 4 taking place at the United Nations next month, as we speak right now in August. The United States has said it won't take part. Is that enough? Or is the United States really sort of not just letting this happen and not doing what it can to combat this within the United Nations?
It's not enough for a lot of reasons. Last December, on December 31st, specifically 2020, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution mandating creating this 20th anniversary celebration of the Durban Conference and its declaration. The Trump administration not only voted against it, as did a few European countries, they voted against the entire 2021 budget of the United Nations because it contained funding for this grotesque anti-Semitism. Now, of course, come January 20th, everything was reversed. And while the Trump administration tried, I think, somewhat without, I don't think it held any prospect of actually happening, but tried for the first year and a half to reform the UN Human Rights Council. They eventually got off of it. They left. And they left because the reform efforts failed, as the reform efforts of the Obama administration also failed, because we don't have the votes. It's really simple at the UN. We're in the minority, and I don't know what it is that people can't quite understand about that.
But just to explain that for a moment, the nations of the third world, the Arab world, they form a majority at the UN, and they are a majority that is in favor of all this invective against Israel and anti-Zionism and indeed anti-Semitism, correct?
There are 193 UN member states. 119 of them belong to the non-aligned movement, so-called non-aligned. Within the non-aligned movement, the largest single voting bloc is the Organization of Islamic Conference. So the Organization of Islamic Countries controls the developing world framework for operating within the United Nations, certainly in the context of anything to do with the Middle East or Israel. And I can give you that number breakdown in the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council is 47 countries. Less than half of them are fully democratic, are free countries. And the African and the Asian groups hold the balance of power. They're the 26 over the 47. And Islamic states are the majority in the African and Asian regional groups. So the Human Rights Council is not only just run by, developing world, but the Islamic world that rejects the very existence of the state of Israel. So that's not going to be reformed. And so this current administration decided, as one of its very first foreign policy moves, to run for election, which is automatic, to the Human Rights Council. And they will be elected in October, November of this year. So they lent immediate credibility they legitimized Israel's delegitimizers. That's what they've done. Mm-hmm. And they've done it in other very startling ways. The chief, I should say, sort of one of the major actors after Mary Robinson with respect to Durban was somebody by the name of Navi Pillay, who was the next UN Human Rights High Commissioner for Human Rights. And Pillay herself was a native of Durban, And there's a story that the mayor of Durban told her to resurrect its good name when she was, happily sent off to Geneva. Well, she created, she was the person behind Durban 2 in 2009. And when President Ahmadinejad, who was the only head of state to go to the so-called Durban Review Conference, stood up and he said, Zionists have ugly faces, and went on to that effect, and said that Israel had been created on the pretext of Jewish sufferings.
Just to clarify for those who don't remember, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was the president of Iran at that time.
Yes, so the Iran was the only head of state to show up, and he represented them, and he stood up, said the Zionists have ugly faces and they're racists, and questioned the Holocaust. Behind him is sitting the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, and Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. And they don't move. They just sit there. And I know from inside the UN that they had the speech in advance. So they knew what he was going to say. They could have made their plans. Many countries got up when he questioned the Holocaust and walked out. Should have walked out a long time ago. It wasn't going to be a surprise what he had to say. But she stayed. So when Durban 2, I should say, in 2009 was discredited, I brought Elie Wiesel and Nathan Sharansky and others to Geneva, who spoke opposite him in another room to the world press. Pillay thought, you know what, I'm going to do something. I'm going to create a next one. I'm going to do it in New York at the time of the opening of the General Assembly. And that way, all the presidents and prime ministers are going to be a captive audience. And they're all going to be forced to sign on to a political declaration reaffirming Durban and, Israel's a racist state idea. And so she did in 2011. There were boycotted by a handful of countries, but the most important ones, all the democratic countries on the have veto holding powers in the Security Council, United States, UK, France, as well as Canada and so on. The move was led by Canada, the Harper government, which was really fantastic in this respect. Obama eventually came on so egregious. And but the point is, Navi Pillay. So to fast forward, the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution this past summer in which it called for a permanent commission of inquiry on Israel. Okay, and now I'll find it somewhere because it's important just to read the text of this thing. And it says this, here's what it says. It says, decides to urgently, this is, by the way, just to reiterate, this is the organization, the institutional framework that the Biden administration has now legitimized. The resolution says, decides to urgently establish an ongoing international commission of inquiry, an ongoing. Doesn't happen in the case ongoing of any other country in the world, to look at underlying root causes of recurrent tensions and instability and protraction of conflict, including systemic discrimination and repression based on national, ethnic, racial, or religious identity. So, and by the way, it then talks about boycotts and can't transfer arms and so on. Who did they just name as the head of the Commission of Inquiry to decide the root causes of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? I ask you. Who do you think they did? Who they
Tell
named?
us.
Oh, Navi Pillay. Unbelievable. The same woman who sat there, legitimizing Ahmadinejad. She put out a press release afterwards after she realized that, oops, it didn't go over too well. but wouldn't stand up and go out. Reaffirmed the Durban Declaration, which picks on Israel, declares it the world's only racist state. She's now going to head a permanent commission of inquiry of the Human Rights Council on racism in the Arab-Israeli conflict. So all of which is to say, this is very much in the here and now. It isn't going away. It's now as I say, the oppositions, those who want to destroy the Jewish state. It's they believe, and I think probably rightly so, is their golden ticket. And we're doing precious little to contradict it.
Well, that's very important. And you've outlined for us very clearly how the UN works, how it has legitimized this anti-Semitic movement. But here's the question. You noted how the Biden administration, among its first acts, was to re-enter the Human Rights Council and to, as you say, lend the legitimacy of the U.S. government to it, which had been withdrawn by its predecessor. But so much of the foreign policy establishment in this country, which is now very much back in charge in Washington, still has this very strong faith in multilateralism and multilateral institutions like the UN. Why is it that this pattern of conduct, this clear path, this chain of events which you've outlined and really just kind of skimmed the surface of, as I think you would concede, that hasn't deterred the foreign policy establishment from its belief in the UN and multilateralism? Why is that? Why is their faith still so unshaken, despite the fact that it is really inextricably tied from a record of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism?
There are two reasons that are given. Number one, without the United Nations, we would have to share the burden. The United Nations is about burden sharing. And so we only pay for 25% of it, between 22 and 25% of everything that happens there. Somebody else pays for the other 75%. So it's a money saving, it's a cost saving vehicle. That's the first reason it's provided. What you need to think about it is if they're working antithetically to the interests of the United States, it's not a saving of money.
Right. Whatever we're paying for it is in fact the waste.
To discredit you. So, it's a kind of an odd way of saying, well, you only contributed a quarter of billions and billions of dollars to your self-destruction. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that there's nothing else. Can't think of anything. No other way to do multilateralism but the UN. This, of course, is ridiculous. Why we can't think of alternatives? First of all, there are alternatives. There are other multilateral venues that we could use, that we could improve upon. We look at NATO and various European-based organizations in the inter-American system. There are alternatives, or we could, in theory, create alternatives with using our collective imagination. There was an effort at some time to create this sort of collection of democracies that would be an alternative to the UN. But the problem was that countries jumped up and down and said, oh, we're not on the inside. And then they opened the floodgates. And then before you know it, there's suddenly, 130 so-called democracies running the sort of the Freedom Council. So and then there's the other thing. We'd rather keep our enemies close. Let them be on the inside, at least they know what they're doing. Everybody who has ever been to the United Nations knows that most of the people working there are spies. I mean, that's what they're doing there. They're collecting information on behalf of their governments. If you've ever walked by the U.S. mission to the United Nations on the First Avenue and seen what it looks like, a place with virtually no windows and walls, this, whatever, I can't put my hands that thick. So, et cetera, et cetera. So it's do we want such an information gathering device? Is it an important feature of our foreign policy? Well, you might say, well, to hold an event, I have another message from Durban. The signs in the streets read, "For the liberation of Quds, machine guns based upon faith and Islam must be used." Okay? And there was another sign that said, "The martyr's blood irrigates the tree of revolution in Palestine." These were massive signs that were dragged through the streets. Now, I moved from Durban directly to New York for the first time on September the 9th, 2001, 2.5 days before 9/11. Nobody who was at Durban and also in New York on 9/11 could fail to connect the dots between the incipient violent and rhetoric of Durban and the hate speech and 9/11 itself. And yet, on September the 22nd of 2021, the United Nations is going to commemorate, is going to celebrate, is going to reaffirm the Durban Declaration right here in New York, just a few miles from 9/11 on its 20th anniversary. It's an outrage. I mean, the people of New York, the mayor of New York, the incoming, most likely mayor of New York, should be out in force, speaking against this as this pretense of human rights protection. And I guess, and we're not there yet. I mean, I'm holding a counter conference. I will try to bring people in to do that. COVID, disrupt me, but it's a drop in the bucket in some respects. Although I know I thought of this conversation with you, and I didn't want to go away without telling people, and young people in particular, not to diminish the power of the individual. It's so important. You may not be part of one of these major Jewish organizations, and et cetera, but you matter, and you can make a difference, and your voices matter, and so you need to be heard, and that's true of ultra cuckers like me too.
Well, that's a very important message. And just to relate it to young people, the influence of these ideas that you've been outlining for us and the way that they have grown in the hothouse of hate at the UN has had a tremendous impact on academia, on college campuses in this country. This is, apartheid Israel is now a regular big lie heard on college campuses, and it's very difficult. I mean, what it requires is the courage of young Jews and young decent people of all faiths to stand up against it. But this is the college campuses really have become the beachhead for these ideas in this country, haven't it?
Yes, and what I would say is, I'll go back again to 1975. The State Department report to Congress that year says the following about the Zionism is racism resolution. It is ominous because it treats the word racism as if it were not the name of a very real and concrete set of injustices, but merely an epithet to be flung at whomever happens to be an adversary. Think about that and how relevant it is today. I mean, 1975. So that's a way of saying to you, yes, young people and others, it's worth educating themselves um, about what happened. By the way, if I could plug we have a website called www.humanrightsvoices.org, and it's meant to be largely an educational information site. So use whatever you want out of it, but and it stores now tens of thousands of pages and documents, and we have found a way to store them so that they're not removed, when links go dead. And so, but what I'm trying to say is there's no shortcut. And I think it's important for young people to know this, and people at universities. There's no shortcut to reading and to learning. And I had to say, a little bit frustrated. I know I'm, maybe illiterate in the world of social media, but I wrote a background paper on Durban, 17 pages long. I had a table of contents that had Q&A, so I thought it was real simple. Just look at the question you're interested in. And I was told it's too long and nobody's going to read 17 pages. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do a PowerPoint, and I'm going to do a PowerPoint with a certain number of slides. And each slide I'm going to make sure has no more than, a dozen words, maybe a couple of dozen at the outside. And I'm going to make sure there's a photograph, a picture, because it's a little more interesting, or like a funny kind of a face or something like that. And then and the power slide presentation was about, I don't know, 10 slides long at the maximum. And the word came back to me that I really didn't get it, because it wasn't short enough, it was too long, and it wasn't funny. So, I just didn't know how to communicate with young people. So, all of which is to say that, my children may say the same thing, but that I have to beseech young people to educate themselves. They owe it to themselves and to their people, and to which, after all, Judaism and the Jewish people have depended on good books and to survive. And we're not going to get away if the only places we're getting information from are memes and Instagram, or social media things that disappear after 5 seconds. So yes, there needs to be some kind of intermediary between the background papers and the language, the lingo of modern day communication. That's important, no doubt. But we seem to be throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. There is no substitute for learning. There is no substitute for getting the facts and putting them forward and learning about what really is going on. And sometimes that does require more than 120 or 240 characters. And I think you're actually right. Let me just ask you, you've spent a lifetime working, an adult lifetime working on these issues. Is there anything about this struggle that has really surprised you? You seem to have seen it all and sort of seen some of the worst of it. Is there anything that really has struck you as you didn't anticipate that, didn't see that coming?
Well, I don't know. Surprise is not the right word. It's not just that human rights got hijacked. It's also that people that ought to have known better have become part of the problem. And when Tom Lantos, the Holocaust survivor, walked out of the Durban Conference because he saw and he feared the anti-Semitism and the reminders for him of the environment of Nazism. What I didn't expect is the reaction from some in the human rights world. there is an individual, her name is Gay McDougall, and McDougall wrote a response to a piece that Lantos wrote called The Durban Debacle. And she said, I can't find it, so I'm going to paraphrase it. She said he'd lost the forest for the trees, that he was parochial, that he gauged the fight against racism through the eyes of narrow-minded Jewish interests. That was an incredible thing to say. The Lantos, by the way, is now the name of the human rights constituency in Congress today. I mean, the Lantos Human Rights group. So he was anything but narrow-minded. But yeah, if I'm reading it, she says Congressman Tom Lantos, who criticized Durban, sees issues of racism only through the lens of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, missing the proverbial forest for the tree. Okay, so the Jew is parochial, but I told you about that meeting at the beginning of August, and the of the Committee on the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People and selected NGOs. And one of the things that they came away with was that they're very happy about, that they promote, is that for key organizations in the United States, they cannot any longer disassociate working on justice and equality without working on Palestinian rights. So on the one hand, you have they have us coming and going, or that's the attempt here. That you're parochial if you think about Jews, but you're not parochial when you do justice and equality necessarily with supposed, as self-declared, Palestinian rights, which means a Judenrein Palestinian state. So to get back to Gay McDougall, you asked me what the surprise was. My surprise was having called Lantos a parochial, narrow-minded individual. What happened after that? She also said in 2004, hypocrisy lurks at the core of the United States. Hypocrisy lurks at the core of our moral identity as a nation, undermining our claims to global leadership. Now, that may be not surprising. What surprises me is that Secretary Blinken turned around and nominated this individual for the post of an independent human rights expert on the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and congratulated her when she was elected. That, to me, still shocks.
That brings us right back to where we started, about the danger of this apartheid lie and the way it is being facilitated by people who should know better. And you've given us so much to think about today. We're going to continue to follow the issue of Durban 4 and your efforts at jns.org. We invite our listeners and viewers to follow along with us at JNS as we follow this issue going forward. We want to thank you, Anne, for taking the time to come on and explain all this to us and telling about your experiences. And thank you to our audience for tuning in, for either listening or watching, either on the YouTube, the JNS YouTube page, or on JBS TV if you're watching it a few months from now. Thank you. Please like, follow, subscribe wherever you are following podcasts. And please, thanks again for tuning in. And next week we will be taking off for Rosh Hashanah, but we'll be back the week after that. So thank you, Shana Tova, and we'll look forward to hearing from you again soon. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, brought to you by the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org. Visit us at jns.org, and please follow at Amazon and Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts.